Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm Tracy Fessenden. I'm here in the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. I'm a faculty member in Religious Studies, and I am delighted to welcome everyone to today's lecture by John Lardis Modern. This event is sponsored by the Beyond Secularization Project, which is made possible by a grant from Templeton Religion Trust. So before we get started, a few reminders. First, please remember to silence your cell phones. Today's event is being live streamed, so I'd also like to give a special welcome to our digital audience. And for those of you here in person, I invite you to join us for a reception in the lobby following the event. As always, details of all our events can be found on our website, and recordings of our past events can be found on YouTube. And now I get to introduce the speaker. If you move in any of the overlapping circles that make up the field of American Religious Studies, you will have heard John Lardis Modern's name a lot. If you move at some of the more jagged edges of these circles, you will have heard the name John Lardis Modern in connection with entities that appear to be quite distinct from the person of John Lardis Modern. These uses of the name are typically given in the form of questions, followed by spirited debate. Who is the John Lardis Modern of pagan philosophers? The John Lardis Modern of independent filmmakers, beat poets, jazz greats? Which Beatle is the John Lardis Modern of the Fab Four? Which is the John Lardis Modern of dive bars, or Pynchon novels, or defunct record labels? Some of these questions are easy. What is the John Lardis Modern of recording media? Vinyl. What is the John Lardis Modern of 70s punk bands? Devo. Akron, Ohio may be the John Lardis Modern of Rust Belt cities, but only if you know some of what Modern has been up to recently, on which more in a moment. Having been party to some of these conversations about the John Lardis Modern of X or Y, I'm delighted to introduce you to John Lardis Modern, the original. John Modern is the Arthur and Catherine Shattuck Professor of the Humanities and Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College. Over the last 2 decades, Modern has produced a steady stream of vibrant, lush, intellectually rich, accessible, and multidisciplinary scholarship on religion in a range of traditional, experimental, and digital formats. His first book, The Bop Apocalypse, explores the spiritual pursuits and literary collaborations of Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William S. Burroughs. His enduringly influential Secularism in Antebellum America shows how conservative religionists, liberal religionists, and spiritual but not religionists jointly inhabit and co-create the peculiar and powerful formation that is American religion and politics, beginning in the 19th century. And it does this with reference to, and I'm reading from the cover, ghosts, Protestant subcultures, machines and their metaphors, mass media, Moby Dick, spirituality, phrenology, anthropology, Sing Sing State Penitentiary, and sex with the new motive power. John's most recent book is the award-winning Neuromatic, A Particular History of the Brain, which John Durham Peters describes as an impish report from the twilight zones of the long history of neuroscience that asks us to unforget all the strange things that went into making the brain a supreme and supposedly secular object. Neuromatic forgoes the long subtitle, but it is just as chock full of beguiling vignettes, some of which you will hear about today. With Catherine Lofton, Modern is co-curator of Frequencies, a collaborative genealogy of spirituality, one of the first great web-based projects in religion hosted by the Eminent Frame, as well as the University of Chicago Press Series Class 200, New Studies in Religion. He is at work on a new monograph, The Book of Akron, which centers a cautionary tale of American modernity on Akron-involved moments and settings over 3 centuries: settler colonialism in Ohio, the Underground Railroad, the Firestone rubber plantation in Liberia, the rise and spectacular fall of the US auto industry, the killings at Kent State, Devo, networked evangelism, and an apocalyptic cultural imaginary that tilts between sci-fi promises and rubble. He is also the PI for the Henry Luce Foundation-funded Machines in Between, a multimedia collaboration between scholars, artists, and others on the entanglements between humans and machines. Episode 4 is out now, whenever you get your audio. His talk today is Religion, Science, a Devolved Manifesto. And if you've seen the poster or you see our sign, there is a set of unpronounceable syllables between religion and science, greater than, less than. I take the unpronounceability to be a provocation, rather than assuming that religion and science are either in conflict, independent of one another, in dialogue with one another, or even potentially integrated. Modern argues that scholars must, first and foremost, account for the history of the categorical distinction between them. How is it that we assume these to be separate? So, without further ado, John Lourdes Modern.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Tracy, for that welcome. And I just want to start out by thanking Tracy, Charlie, and Heather, Alex, for being such a great host in the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. I've had a lovely time here in Tempe, and I'm excited to be here, and I'll get started. So let's have some fun. Time really does a number upon our categorical distinctions. For there are changing rhythms and mutual constitutions. History ever outs the contingency within each of them, fabricates them, and changes them willy-nilly, precisely because they were never stable essences to begin with. Moreover, and perhaps inevitably, the practices to which the categories of religion and science refer morph and mutate, ever gestating into something they previously were not. As I demonstrated in Neuromatic, the history, authority, and reach of the cognitive and neurosciences, for example, are not merely bound up in the history of religion, but have also produced particular forms of technique and devotion at every turn. In the title of my talk this afternoon, I tentatively propose using the less than, greater than symbols to represent this relationship, an empty space or perhaps a relationship wrought by indeterminacy. I am open to changing it, but for now the symbol stands in for the blur that can be pointed at, gestured toward, and perhaps even felt or glimpsed in storied moments, but remains at the end of the day obscure. So rather than tend to meanings and essences, the domain of science as compatible with the domain of religion or incompatible or independent from it, might we instead, I ask, recognize that religion and science lend themselves to such an authoritative range of alignments precisely because of the initial and generative instability of each domain? Because the categories of religion and science both oversell what they claim to represent, might there be a point in suspending their authority in one's analysis? Might we then be able to better appreciate, yes, even more objectively, what differences there are between practices? So rather than ask what religion is or what science is in an attempt to define the cognitive content of each domain, one might instead ask what knowledge does in pursuing it, in having it, in exposing it. How, asked Michel Foucault a while back, is knowledge performative, and how does one move among its causes and effects, unquote. Practices that announce themselves as scientific deserve the kind of treatment honed by scholars of secularism over the past decade or so. This does not mean treating science as a religion. It means instead to treat science as if it had no origin. For at any given time over the past 2 centuries, religion and science have been products of the same network of influences and mutual modification. Scientists are ever burdened in this secular age with the need to differentiate themselves from bad religion. By the beginning of the 20th century, there was an almost universal, if tacit, understanding that the term science excluded aesthetic, moral, and theological concerns. Indeed, the nova effect of secularism in the second half of the 19th century did much to give epistemic shape and political contour to a self-conscious practice and worldview of science. The swirl of institution building, discipline, cash, and so-called secular prestige has since precipitated, in the words of Lisa Sedaris, a, quote, fictional historical warfare of science and religion that established territorial boundaries for science while lending it an appearance of internal cohesion, unquote. It is difficult to choose among so many delicious examples of this enabling fictionality, but I would point out the fraught establishment of the world religions paradigm, or say the budding self-consciousness among American neurologists for whom spiritual mediums were objects of inquiry precisely because they posed a gendered challenge to the organized knowledge about the brain. Or take E.B. Tylor, a key figure in the institutionalization of anthropology whose failure to, quote, escape from the regions of transcendental philosophy and theology, unquote, that's his quote, and articulation of a universal science of culture was manifest in his pursuit of the moral laws that govern our thoughts, wills, and actions. These laws, he concluded, were as definitive as those which govern the motions of waves, the combination of acids and bases, and the growth of plants and animals, unquote. Or lastly, recall the physicist John Tyndall, who proclaimed in his 1874 presidential address to the British Association for the Advancement of Science that, quote, men of science shall wrest from theology the entire domain of cosmological theory. All schemes and systems which infringe upon the domain of science must, insofar as they do this, submit to its control and relinquish all thought of controlling it, unquote. For reasons that will soon become clear, I have recently been drawn to Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society as a way to better understand the compatibilities between these scenes in which science seeks to compete with religion as an authoritative approach to an accumulation of knowledge. For according to Ellul, in a time of voracious formations of technoscience, what is mediating the space between, let's say, my brain and yours right now, my body and yours, the space between the religious and the scientific, and increasingly every nook and cranny of bodies, minds, and the unconscious, is what he calls technique. The Technological Society was first published in French in 1954 and translated into English in 1964. Ellul's dark prophecies about technique as an intelligence that was both artificial and demonic found traction among those attuned to the cybernetic effects in their midst. For Ellul, technique was atmospheric, a surround sound leviathan whom we might hear but not see. Technique, writes Ellul in typical fashion, is, quote, the noise of that monster boring into us every hour of the night without respite, unquote. In Technological Society, Ellul put on a dramatic reading of technique as autonomous. Technique could not be reduced to either machines themselves or scientific practice or even the cumulative action of individuals. Rather, technique lies behind the integration of machines and science and individuals into society. Ellul points to the 19th century as the time when technique, as aided by the institutionalization of science, integrated machines into society and adapted humans to a, quote, world of steel by inviting them to live in a world without mystery or contingency and to placate them with the, quote, consoling hum of a unified society. If Ellul sounds like he is prophetically wailing against a false god, that's because he is. In 1948, for example, Ellul delivered a speech in absentia at the Amsterdam Assembly of the World Council of Churches, and a gathering that Time magazine called the greatest Protestant gathering since the Reformation. There, Ellul urged Protestant denominations to resist theologically and politically large-scale bureaucratization and the momentum of technological advance. In tones mixed with existentialism and Calvinist hyperbole, Ellul pulled no punches. Quote, no one will publish a book attacking the real religion of our times, he complained, by which I mean the dominant social forces of the technological society, unquote. For Ellul, the imperatives of science made material demands upon populations and psyches both. Science was, he argues, the handmaiden of technique. To progress, writes Ellul, technique had to wait for science, unquote. According to Ellul, technique began to, quote, develop and extend itself only after science appeared. Science had been itself an accretion of technique, but had now become the instrument of the technological society, the main sort of instrument. There was a positive feedback loop positive feedback loop at work in Ulul's imagination of the technological society, with the effects of technique fueling scientific inquiry that then extends the reach of technique, so on and so forth. So Ulul did not think through the religious secular continuum as such. His concept of technique does much to illuminate a particular quality of scientific inquiry in the 19th century as well as the present age. For rather than get bogged down in defending himself as anti-science, Ulul wrote that, quote, "It is not a question of minimizing the importance of scientific activity, but of recognizing that, in fact, scientific activity has been superseded by technical activity to such a degree that we can no longer conceive of science without its technical outcome," unquote. So Ulul is my jumping off point as I talk a little bit about my current research on the global rubber industry and post-punk art scenes of Akron, Ohio. This is part of a larger project called the Book of Akron that seeks to narrate a history of rubber without recourse to the comforts and imagined stabilities of secular critique. Rather than reproduce the disciplinary distinctions that have organized scientific work in general, or parrot the categorical assumptions necessary for accomplishing such work, I want instead to glimpse a few of the worlds that the science of rubber generated. In the first few, and here we go, some scenes from Akron. In the first decades of the 19th century, chemists were already at work attempting to break down rubber into its component parts. Rubber soon became an intense site of engineering advance. In 1834, for example, the year after the word scientist was coined, Charles Goodyear walked past the Roxbury India Rubber Company in New York. He was taken with a variety of rubber goods that were available for sale. Goodyear became, from that point on, obsessed with making rubber more useful. "There is probably no other inert substance," gushed Goodyear, "which so excites the mind." Initially, Goodyear was interested in making rubber less sticky, applying heat and sulfur in different combinations. Goodyear experimented with hot sand, flat irons, boiling water, and finally decided it was steam applied for approximately 6 hours at approximately 130 degrees Celsius that gave him the optimal results. A new substance that would not melt under extreme heat nor crack under extreme cold. Goodyear named this process vulcanization, after Vulcan, the Roman god of fire. Goodyear would patent this process in 1843, and in 1851 he sponsored a stand at the Crystal Palace exhibition where he presented samples of soft vulcanized rubber to an adoring audience. Goodyear's work set off a frenzy for patent making among chemists, industrialists, and botanists over the next half century as they sought to improve on the vulcanization process so as to make it better, faster, stronger, more reliable, and just right for human taste, desire, consumption, and profit. Within a few years of Goodyear's Crystal Palace exhibition, British colonial agents involved with the Royal Botanical Gardens had begun considering how they might create agricultural plantations and lines of scientific communication across their vast empire. The Royal Botanical Gardens, with 1 foot in the tropics of each hemisphere, with colonies in both wet and dry environments, set plants wherever it saw commercial possibility. At this time, Brazilian rubber in the Amazon basin became a site of great interest to Britain, as foreign investors secured large tracts of land with concessions from the Brazilian, Bolivian, and Peruvian governments. And to make a long story very short, over the next 2 decades, colonial agents hatched plots to transport wild rubber from Brazil to other parts of the British Empire. In 1876, a colonial agent named Clement Markham was put on the case. In 1861, Markham had organized the movement of the Cinchona tree from the Amazon basin to India by way of the Royal Botanical Gardens. Cinchona was the Andean fever bark tree from which quinine was made. Markham's move had ushered in an age of cheap and reliable manufacture of quinine, which allowed for the prevention and control of malaria. This nifty trick of global transport, it should be noted, would pave the way for the colonial penetration of Africa by European powers and stabilize forms of colonial governance across the tropical world. Charged With a new caper 15 years later, in 1876, Markin contacted an English speculator by the name of Henry Wickham, who was then living in Brazil. Wickham was a free agent, as it were, and had avoided working with locals by hiring ex-Confederate soldiers to work on his agricultural commune. Wickham was then hired by the British government to smuggle viable seeds out of Amazonia and to arrange for their transportation back to the botanical gardens. 70,000 rubber tree seeds in all, the equivalent of 3/4 of a ton of cargo. The seeds arrived in June of 1876 and were immediately planted. And within a few weeks, 2,000 of them had germinated through grafting. The British were able to produce more robust seedlings, and they were then able to distribute to all parts of the empire in terms of trying to sort of, in a sense, propagate this sort of initial sort of theft from Amazonia. Over the next 3 decades, the plantation systems developed in each of these areas under British colonial rule prospered. And by 1915, Singapore had over 700,000 acres planted with natural rubber trees. In Southeast Asia, production at that point had indeed overtaken the production in Brazil and other places. The plantation system brought with it all manner of elaborate rituals for planting and spacing rubber trees, maximizing production by optimizing the tapping schedule. Manuals were minted for instructing workers on what side of the rubber tree and where to tap first, how to move one's cut from day to day, and what angled cuts worked the best for long-term viability. Economic considerations were firmly fixed on future profits and investments according to the natural life cycle of the tree, all optimized under the banner of predictive botany. Here is a story of secularization that revolves around technique, specifically the extraction, collection, and manufacture of rubber, moving from industrial tappers to community resource to family farms and small properties to small plantations, and eventually city-states across the colonies. The arc remained relatively consistent. Civilize the savage through colonization, secularize them through work, control their flora through chemistry, displace their religion with whatever could be mustered, and incorporate it all into a larger product of political and scientific conquest. In 1926, kind of fast forwarding, Harvey S. Firestone contracted Harvard University to initiate an ethnographic expedition to Liberia to investigate its flora, fauna, and cultures with the hopes of turning that knowledge toward his economic advantage. The expedition was led by a man named George Schwab, who took an 8-month leave of absence from his position at the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions. Before eventually purchasing 1/10 of Liberia for his growing tire industry, Firestone had assigned Schwab to calculate the population's potential labor value in the service of a benevolent plan of maximum capitalization. As Schwab and his team traveled along routes that connected missionary outposts and collected data along the way, all details were significant: race, religion, reason, social life, natural resources, behavior, belief, the molecular details of diet, infant mortality rates, sexually transmitted diseases, malaria, intestinal parasites, leprosy, and goiter. In their accumulation, Schwab's data points achieved the appearance of cohesion and totality, of accounting for life itself in Liberia. The sensitivity to pain among Liberians, their olfactory and taste systems, their mobility of character, their egoism and affections, these are categories that he was using, their bonds of friendship and family, their moral faculties, their self-interest, caprice, and gross mysticism, as well as their orientation toward the concept of truth, their sense of contract and capacity to comprehend abstractions, such as loyalty and justice, their humor and penchant for gaiety, musical and singing ability and intelligence, diet, their capacity to concentrate, so on and so forth. In Schwab's report, the souls of Liberians were reduced to their biology, which were then transformed into standing reserve to be integrated into an expanding global market of rubber. Liberian religiosity, defined by Schwab, was a, quote, extensive and complicated system of rules and regulations governing all the details of life. That was to be replaced, according to Schwab, by a new moral basis and new restraints that would maintain clan solidarity but do it in a way that would promote and create the conditions of possibility for the fire rubber stone plantation. The goal here, according to Schwab, was to operationalize this definition of religion by way of scientific research, technical advance, and incredible amounts of capital. Between the 1930s and 1960s, the major tire companies and their downtown Akron factories were producing nearly 2/3 of all tires in the US market. The vast majority of these tires were bias ply tires. By the late 1960s, however, the science had advanced beyond the bias ply and decidedly against Akron. In 1966, the French company Michelin contracted with Sears Roebuck to sell radial tires to the American market. Radials lasted longer than bias ply tires, were more fuel efficient, and significantly reduced the odds of catastrophic tire failure. In a bias ply tire, the center tread and sidewalls were independent of one another, with the body consisting of multiple rubber piles. Radial tires, by contrast, were based on a design that broke a single tire into subsystems that interacted with each other. New applications in synthetic rubber and higher-level mathematics had been applied. The radial cords in the sidewall enabled the inner core to act like a spring and to bend and absorb the road. This resulted in more cushion and greater ride comfort. The rigid steel belts wrapped around the inside of the tread and reinforced the strength of the surface. Increased stability in the tread region resulted in higher mileage and longevity, much longer than the bias ply. Each system worked together in the radial but was individually engineered for total optimum performance. You see a pattern here, of course. By 1983, the bias ply had become obsolete, as did all of Akron's industrial infrastructure. All totaled, by 1983, 20,000 rubber workers had lost their jobs. It's important to note that during the incursion of the radial standard, Akron had become subject to a new kind of corporate strategy that utilized systems analysis to streamline industrial processes, to the point where the end of Akron could in fact be predicted and its obsolescence optimized. Indeed, well before the first factory closing in the mid-1970s, Akron had been deemed suboptimal by engineers that utilized systems analysis to streamline manufacturing processes. Large capital expenditures no longer made their way to Akron and were primarily going toward the construction of radial tire plants and fast-tracking conversion of bias ply tire facilities elsewhere. Executive decisions had been made. Unions had little leverage to counter divestiture in Akron or long-term planning. And in making divestiture less visible as a strategy, macroeconomic trends made it less subject to organized resistance. Jerry Casale, co-founder of the Akron punk band Devo, drew inspiration from what he called the, quote, blue-collar victim aesthetic of Akron that served as what he called an art-directed backdrop for this kind of music we were making. It had this hellish, depressing patina, this kind of dirty latex layers that fills the air, unquote. Devo originated as an idea, as a band, as a conceptual art project among Kent State University students in the early 1970s who found common cause in the work, you guessed it, of Jacques Ellul. And I'm just going to play a little Devo here. This is where you have to turn it off for copyright purposes. But this is a song from 1974. It was recorded about 3 blocks from my house in Norton, Ohio, in the basement of a car wash. And it was written, it's a song that's about an event, a car crash in Akron where somebody ran over some people in Youngstown, actually. But it's sort of a weird allegory of the Kent State shootings, but more importantly, you get a sense of where this music is coming from and what the sound of things falling apart might sound like. So, well, let's see. Okay. Let's see how this goes. Okay. The impetus for Devo began in the wake of the murder of 4 students at Kent State University on May 4th, 1970. Jerry Casale, Bob Lewis, and the Mothersbaugh brothers, Mark and Bob, each witnessed the militarization of the Kent State campus and its senseless ending. The May Day protest over President Nixon's expansion of the war into Cambodia morphed into confrontations between students and police, and by weekends, and the Ohio National Guard. Initially, battles were largely over tear gas as guardsmen played a perpetual game of cat and mouse with a roving mass of protesters. But technique, as Ulul would say, possessed a logic of its own. For it became obvious to members of Devo on that day that machines were built with purpose and the promise of an endgame defined by the technical horizon of science. This was the nature of the tools human developed within a state of, quote, total integration. They tell stories of their own, be it a Bunsen burner, or a radial tire, or a gas mask, or the loaded M1 Garand rifles that would eventually discharge 67 bullets in 13 seconds at approximately 12:24 p.m. on May 4th. In the summer of 1972, the Los Angeles staff published the first Devo communiques written by Jerry Casale and Bob Lewis. In Polymer Love, Jerry Casale offered a perverse portrait of technique and the implantation of desire. And the members of Devo were introduced to the work of Jacques Ellul from a professor named Eric Mottram, who was an English professor who was also was sort of into William Burroughs and did some interviews with Burroughs. Very interesting sort of kind of critic, but that's where they got their Ellul fix. In another communique from Bob Lewis, responded to the saturation of technique by pleading with his audience to read Jacques Ellul. Quote, as Ellul says, warned Lewis, anyone who maintains that he can escape technique is either a hypocrite or unconscious. The autonomy of technique forbids the man of today to choose his destiny, unquote. But rather than bemoan this situation, Lewis celebrates that extinction. One might even call it a religious embrace of contingency and that which has not yet been technicized. As Lewis testified, his was a critical response to technique's seeming refusal to accept any judgments upon it, unquote. For the, quote, invasion of technique had desacralized the world, unquote. That is, it imagined the world as transparent and inert, so as nothing remained secret, mysterious, or taboo. The aim of Devo, continued Lewis, was to reach the, quote, wretched victims of the Malachites, who exploit them by convincing them of their own coherence and the orderly categorical sheen of their world. The aim of Devo, wrote Lewis, continued Lewis, was to inject some notion of the transcendent into their bleak existence and to convert them into what Lewis called de-evolutionaries or devotees. The converted would no longer be proud, he says, of what they knew, but they would be ashamed of their ignorance. They would no longer be proud of what they knew and ashamed of their ignorance, but would, quote, develop an awareness of both the forces and choices, in quotes, which have led them to this point, unquote. Calling for a fluid catharsis of the human, Lewis sought to convince his reader that we might put all categories in quotation marks, including those of choice and self. In calling for an anti-humanist or maybe a post-humanist revival, Lewis pointed out a present crisis as an opportunity to think and live through the implosion of a certain kind of freedom and to revel playfully in newfound configurations of self and world, certainty and chance, religion and science. One of these configurations may be found in Mark Mothersbaugh's My Struggle, the lead singer of Devo, printed in 1978 to resemble a cross between Mao's Little Red Book and a religious tract, complete with prayer bookmarker. Authored by Boogie Boy, Mothersbaugh's alter ego and masked spirit of de-evolution, My Struggle was also a missionary strategy with roots in the mimeograph revolution of Northeast Ohio at that time, centered around the poet D.A. Levy, and RJS, a printer, the latter being the person who actually did the typesetting for My Struggle. During the encore of early Devo shows, Mothersbaugh donned his Boogie Boy mask, sung in a high-pitched baby yap, and handed out copies of My Struggle to audience members assuming the role of a grotesque colporteur. My Struggle is a difficult book to describe, but Mothersbaugh insisted that my struggle was, quote, about life in Akron and life in general. Presented as a bent spiritual biography, it tells the tale of Boogie Boy's struggle to come to terms with and provide terms for the anonymous force of technique undergirding his very being. In its dot matrix lineation, the sheen and shape of my struggle conjures a technological order in which language is slotted into block chunks, lines are fitted margin to margin, and words are split without hyphenation, severed by the click-clatcheting of a carriage return in a small room. Yet, this repetition of form, signaling Boogie Boy's channel of consciousness, is everywhere interrupted and cut with images that are simultaneously sexual, violent, grotesque, and whimsical. Blasts of intimate perversion coming through the seeming automaticity of computer type. My struggle is a bloody, sex-soaked, scatological, and relentless assault on the sensorium. A cascade of images that trouble at every turn, that at once mock, celebrate, confirm, and subvert secular preoccupations with the propriety of the interior. There is little in the way of identifiable points of resolve in my struggles, spastic, jagged, erotic splay. And as the reader learns in the foreword to my struggle, Boogie Boy's significance, quoting my struggle, his significance lies in his divine purposelessness. It is purgative, a solution for the sometimes necessary high colonic, wiping the system clean and exposing it to view. Like the microorganisms discussed earlier, Boogie Boy performs a service. The work represents an untutored, prepubescent readout on all particles passing through his chamber. He is technique in reverse. The information enters, is twisted, frequency analyzed, and mutated without prehension. His work is a headache for those who need to invent systems to give themselves an erroneous feeling of security, unquote. Page after tiny page, the book's like this big. Human interiors are portrayed as vulnerable to technological conditions. Artificial inseminations and inductions, rubber love garments, mechanical vaginal linings, rubber replacement testicles, and industrial rooms set up for advanced sexual therapy preoccupy Boogie Boy. The vibe here was not so much of the erasure of hierarchies as much as those hierarchies and differences, religious, scientific, and sexual difference in particular, mutating into unpredictable cyborg forms. In his advice to, quote, be your own mutation, Mothersbaugh noted the seriousness of his imminent critique. For My Struggle announces itself as a book of social science, an eyewitness account of the inevitable mutation of the species. In My Struggle, in contrast to modern science, Boogie Boy revels in anti-becoming, given his revelation that, quote, truth is queerer than reality, unquote. Not merely conjuring a permeability of the private and public, the scientific and the religious, man and woman, Boogie Boy seeks to dwell in the space between. This space is ugly, bizarre, silly, and discomforting. It is a space that is integral to perpetual change and transformation. My point in reading My Struggle as a bent spiritual biography is not to set a definitional precedent that will establish criteria to now measure what counts as religion and what does not. Rather, I want to highlight what is most fascinating about the world of Devo and the Akron artists they would inspire. And it's this, that they refused, played with, mocked, and reconfigured all manner of categorical distinctions in the service of a politics and a metaphysics that acknowledged how fluid catharses of self and world were features and not glitches of technological saturation. Chemical Girl, AKA Dana Beasley, was a graduate student in the Kent State Psychology Department in the early 1980s. While studying how alcohol and amphetamines attenuated aggression, she fell in with the male art scene in Kent, and she had access to a photocopier. She started making merch and ephemera for local bands, and soon founded the, quote, the Kent Chemical Group and published the Chemical of the Month Bulletin. As Beasley wrote, in the early 1980s, during the height of America's attraction to health foods and exercise, there arose a heroine to bravely combat the illusions of this lifestyle. A paragon of high-tech realism, Chemical Girl pointed out the dangers of nature, and educated the nation about the protective, nurturing influence of chemistry upon modern man, unquote. The Chemical of the Month Bulletin was an early example of feminist zine culture, privileging production, outreach, and engagement over consumption. There was a hint of aggression, Beasley admits. Her zine intended to needle, provoke, and perhaps even transform one's appreciation for the chemical atmosphere of Akron. Like Boogie Boy, Chemical Girl offered a deadpan and razor-sharp embodiment of techno-science. But where the irony was fairly thick with Mother's Law, Beasley did not let you in on the joke as much, at least in my reading, at least not right away. Describing hers as, quote, a publication devoted to advancing the appreciation of chemicals, chemical products and byproducts and other high-tech things, Beasley offered a simultaneous affirmation and lampooning of science, affirming its will to know, but also revealing its bizarre endgame. Each issue of the Chemical of the Month Bulletin was informative, containing technical descriptions of chemical compositions that swerve in whimsical directions. In a nod to both Elul and Devo, the bulletin proclaimed that anything worth living for had become chemical. And thank God for that, since otherwise there would be nothing worth living for. Love, for example, declared Chemical Girl was not, quote, a natural spontaneous process as is typically conceived by romantics. Attaining a state of love takes considerable effort, she wrote. In fact, in their natural states, humans are not attracted to one another and often find each other quite repugnant. Chemicals facilitate the occurrence of love, unquote. In pointing out such substances as mouthwash, chocolates, perfumes, and alcohol, the issue also came with a packet of red Valentine's Day candy with the chemical composition of corn syrup printed on the front. Each issue of the Chemical of the Month Bulletin was also interactive and depended upon a face-to-face encounter with Chemical Girl as she handed out copies of on the campus of Kent State University. Each came with all manner of material objects: homemade buttons, earrings, fake coupons for prescription drugs, non-sequitur diagrams, and how to set plastic using polyvinyl chloride, etc., etc. She included baggies of asphalt and fertilizer, a packet of silicone gel used in breast implants, or a sample of para-aminobenzoic acid, the ingredient found in sunscreen. One of the last bulletins Beasley produced was dedicated to the chemistry of decomposition. In it, Chemical Girl offers a clinical definition of death, wrapped in a religious ode. Quote, "Since the dawn of mankind," she writes, "the human mind has pondered death, searching for the answer to its mysteries. Now, when mankind is surrounded by death and destruction as never before, it becomes essential that we study the problems of death and to try to understand its true meaning. The meaning of death can be found in the stages of decomposition," writes Chemical Girl. Decomposition is the process by which plant and animal decay supply precious nitrogen compounds to the soil. The scientific entry of the Chemical Bulletin ends with a citation, not from a famous chemist, but from Cher. And this is the quote: "Quite obviously, the decomposition of our flesh would be very painful and unsavory. It would be an unsavory process were we to be alive to experience it." Chemical Girl, in her wry scientific pose and prose, celebrates the ways in which our dead are put to good use by again listing entries for nitrogen and ammonia, and noting too how science had found a way to instrumentalize each gas to benefit human endeavors, from warmongering to laughing gas to the production of cleaning agents, poisons, and toothpaste. All good uses, to be sure. Beasley cast the decomposition issue as a religious parable of science, turning the miraculous promise of science to the most absurd of ends. She offers a parable about the death and resurrection of Chemical Girl in the last issue of her zine. After announcing the makeover of the Kent Chemical Corporation into the newly named Rubber City ChemCorp, we learned that, quote, "in a magic and terrible flash, the fire destroyed the Rubber City ChemCorp's new lab, machinery, chemical products, and alas, Chemical Girl herself." And over the next few weeks, long-faced mourners combed through the empty lot where her ashes lay, hoping to find a lock of hair, a rubber stopper, or some other souvenir. Citywide ceremonies took place, causing industry and commerce activities to come to a grinding halt. This is all Chemical Girl. The tragedy of her demise faded as time passed, however, and soon Akron was returned to its usual routine. Rubber workers resumed their jobs, and soon the natural vulcanization process, which made Akron famous, were once more underway. But one day, in an Akron city park, lightning struck a Diet Coke can, and the apparition of Chemical Girl immediately sprang up out of the dirt. She floated above the ground, hazy and one-dimensional at first, her image gradually taking on a more substantial form. A group of young children in the park stand aghast at the miracle they have just witnessed. A reborn Chemical Girl with punkish new wave hair. Rumors aswirl about the, quote, new improvised idiot savant messiah of chemistry, unquote. On the back page of the flyer, a new gospel in the form of an equation explains the principle of resurrection. For the resurrection, like death itself, may be broken down, analyzed, explained, and put to good use. The science of chemistry once again has shown itself to own up to the task of confirming the revealed truths of the natural world. As she says, reports, a Dr. Mo Virabuck of the Cleveland Polymer Group is cited and cites this doctor as saying resynthesis was caused by a chemical process that involved many steps, including the vulcanization, the process of heating rubber with sulfur, producing incredibly high percentages of the poison gas sulfur dioxide in the air. Unquote. Marion and Jesus-like, both. Chemical Girl dons a wry smile and tells a story that reveals the ravenous epistemic designs of science. Designs that are tragically flawed, designs that are ready-made to blur into what they imagine they are not. A new religion is about to be born again. Together, these scenes of Akron speak to the raw power of technique and the momentous repetition of its sequencing, and those moments in which the inevitable blur between religion and science was most evident. In the 1970s and 1980s, just as it had done for much of the previous century, technique was ushering in a new world. In the streets and suburbs of Akron, the boundary between science and religion imploded amidst a rapid downsizing of all manner of lives and value in which no particular collective was in charge. It is a matter of record that plumes of burning rubber emanating from Akron tire factories over the course of the 20th century registered their effects at the visceral level. Cancers, emphysema, and chronic dermatitis, among other conditions. For lest we forget, the smell of rubber was made up of rubber dust, unreacted chemicals, plasticizers, mold tubes, and other volatile organic compounds released into the atmosphere to great harm to workers and community alike. So over the course of this lecture, I have pushed on this diagnostic in order to consider mutations in human sensibility among those who were saturated with an Akron atmosphere of technique. Drawing from the post-punk art scenes of Akron, Ohio, and the lingering frame of Jacques Ellul's Technological Society as my witness, I have argued that one must be sensitive to the recurring interplay of religion and science, not in order to trace the gradual curve of their separation or evolution, but rather to isolate the different worlds that such ever-changing interplay generated. So rather than assume that religion and science are inevitably in conflict or independent from one another or in dialogue or even potentially integrated, I am arguing that whatever we are talking about when we talk about religion, science, and their relationality, that we must constantly and reflexively account for the historicity of this categorical distinction, which is to say that we should not believe in it. For looking back upon the early art of Devo, Boogie Boy, and Chemical Girl, one is struck by how the criteria for demarcating science from religion had already become a graphic punchline and subject to much joyous ridicule. Thank you. 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . . 。 . . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 .
。 .
that your question will register on the video that our folks at home are watching.
All the folks at home, yeah.
I have a question, John, if
Yeah.
I could start. Your the scene of the rubber plantation in Liberia that Firestone and Schwab started was very striking in that the systematizing and optimizing of this population was given such a religious form, right? I mean, the form of the project was there was a real teleology to it. But I'm wondering, what I didn't hear in their discussion of the biopower, the labor that would make this happen, was anything about Liberia itself as a project, as an experiment, which certainly was fraught, but certainly had its own telos, right?
Yes.
Its own desire for something that was not endless capital expansion. So I wondered if there was anything in your research that suggested that Firestone and Schwab were even aware of what Liberia was.
That's a great question. I have not found any kind of sustained, I can't imagine you wouldn't know a certain kind of history of the formation of Liberia and the American Colonization Society, but I have not run across anything, at least in Schwab's documents, that he sort of refers to it as a kind of hopeful project of a certain kind of, freedom out of the 19th century. One of the things that I think, for me, one of the things, I love Sylvester Johnson's chapter on Liberia in his book. I forget the name of the title of the book, but it's like this really wonderful sort of portrayal and framing of the sort of origins of Liberia and the aftermath as a kind of just new kind of colonial form, right? And so the way in which freed slaves and free blacks were able to go to Liberia and get a plot of land, it sort of pushed natives in Liberia to the hinterland and caused all kinds of similar kinds of things that you would imagine would happen when that takes place. And what's interesting about it just seems like there's a way in which my project, in a lot of ways, is sort of tells the same story of the end of the world over and over and over and over again. And so, there's something about the project of liberation and freedom that Liberia represents. It's not that. And it's, Firestone had a hand in playing a role in that kind of crazy turmoil. But also, I think there's something kind of baked in a little bit to the project as well, from the certain aspirations that are, and desires that are motivating that. They're benevolent, but they're also laced with a certain, I don't know what you want to call it, biopolitical sort of strain. Yeah.
Charlie.
Thank you for that talk. I kind of want to keep going with this question and just think with it. Because part of the argument in that chapter of Sylvester Johnson's that you're talking about is that, to summarize it really briefly, freed black people in the United States are on one end of a kind of racial hierarchy, right? So they go to Liberia, and now they're kind of in charge of society. And what they do, Sylvester argues, is they become at the top of a racial hierarchy because they are Christians, and the colonized people, they become colonizers. And what makes them at the top is the fact that they are Christian and the people they have colonized are not Christian, mostly. Or at least they're a different kind or whatever. Mm-hmm. They're becoming Christian. They're sort of missionizing them at the same time. In your description of what was going on in the sort of moral control of Liberia, making better workers, you called it secularization because they were transforming the religion and moral codes and whatever of the workers. But I don't know if what happened in the 1820s and 30s could be described as secularization. It's a sort of racialization through colonialism. So I'm wondering if you can reflect on that tangle, especially since, as Tracy said in the intro, part of what you're doing in the project is thinking about settler colonialism in Akron. So I wonder if you could sort out that kind of tangler of settler colonialism, racialization, and secularization.
Thank you. Try to tackle that one element at a time. And so secularization, when I say this is a story of secularization, I'm not sure I would sort of buy, displacement of religion, that kind of classic narrative. But, what I find about, in terms of Sylvester's argument about a certain kind of Christian hierarchy that is sort of on the ground there, the way in which Schwab and his team of researchers sort of approached it, he does talk about a certain displacement of indigenous religion. He's not, he's not looking to go on the coast where all the people in charge are. He's going into the hinterlands. And he sees, he's trying to understand their religion, but he also is working quite literally with the E.B. Tyler definition of religion. And he's doing the kind of work, like how do we translate that work into, how do we translate that worldview, that metaphysics into something that's going to be productive for us? How do we sort of make that kind of transition? And so to the degree to which that secularization, something's happening there. It's not so much the loss of religion, but it is a kind of interesting sort of mutation, let's say, of that. And so, in the way in which I'm thinking about the larger project, the early parts of the book really do deal with the kind of, the sort of settlement of Northeast Ohio and how that kind of gets off the ground in the early 18th century. And it is this, it's the story that we know, but it's a kind of interesting, in the Ohio Valley in Ohio, there is, kind of influx of displaced natives who are moving westward, right? Who are then displacing other natives. And then you get colonizers coming in there, and it's a hot mess in terms of a kind of free-for-all in a lot of ways. And so that project is much messier. I don't think there's not the scientific team who's like trying to determine, but it is this, for lack of a better word, tragic sort of story of human beings thrust into this sort of shared situation without the kind of proper resources to negotiate it, kind of thing. But I do see it, again, going back to my initial, it is this kind of weird thing about Akron, Ohio, where if you kind of circle around it, you see these worlds opening up and closing down over and over again. I think that's kind of what I gravitate toward, which might, maybe, if I think through this enough, might be my new definition of secularization. Yes?
Yes, I'm going to give you the mic.
Oh.
Well, thinking of religion and science,
Yeah.
what's your opinion of the movement of a national Christian country being stated about the United States? And how would that affect research budgets in the United States? I don't think it's going to come to be, but I mean...
I'm against it. And I don't think it would bode well for the kind of, at least like what I do. I think I might be pointed out first and gotten rid of. So, yeah, I'm suspicious of the project, but also perhaps a little petrified of that possibility.
Wow. Me too.
Oh, that's good. I can tell by your beret.
Hava.
I would like to hear more about the environmental dimension of the story of Akron. Oh, however you pronounce it. Is it
Yes.
Akron or Akron?
Akron, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So were there demonstrations at the time in the 70s or early 80s? And how does it fit with the other larger?
Yeah, no, okay, so, the environmental, Akron is a hub of rubber production, but also polychemical research, right? And it is a poison place, and if you ever drive through Ohio, be sure to stop in downtown Akron. You still have the Goodyear tire factory and the Firestone rubber factory are still there, just decaying.
Just don't breathe.
Don't breathe, right? And so, I grew up in Akron, and, in the 1970s and 1980s, but in the 1970s, it really, the smell of rubber was intense everywhere, right? And there's long histories, legal histories of different kinds of lawsuits and different kinds of poisoning and environmental sort of dumps happening all over the place.
Didn't hurt your growth.
Didn't hurt my growth, no. And so it is one of those sites that is, I think, it's poisoned, and both literally and figuratively in a lot of ways. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was, labor, this didn't happen without a fight. But what I've relied on different kinds of, historians of labor and business to sort of guide me on this. And it seems there is a compelling case to be made, as I mentioned, that in a lot of ways this sort of takedown of Akron as a sort of hub of the American tire industry, really the global tire industry, didn't happen overnight. It happened over the course of the 1960s. And you had people really thinking through, like, what the 5-10 years, what this is going to look like, what could that factory do, how much is it going to cost to replace that? And at some point, by the mid to late 1960s, at least the Firestone Rubber Company had decided, like, we're out of here. But they didn't tell anybody, and that was one of the things that the labor leaders in the 1970s, when they got word of this happening, it was a foregone conclusion at that point, in a lot of ways. And so, and there is, Firestone has never released. I mean, there are secretive. You can't really get to their records at all in terms of what they were doing in the 1960s, and in terms of thinking through a certain kind of escape hatch for their business, and regardless of how it might affect anybody. And once Firestone goes, it kind of begins to, yes.
Thanks. This was great, thank you. And I want to invite you to reflect a little more on your new definition of secularism, which is interesting, among other things, if I get it rightly, because it is very strongly insisting on a reinsertion into temporality. These comings into being, decay, and stories. So it's a challenge to both an idea of eternity and an idea of linear progress. And so I think that's really interesting. I want to hear more, and I want to hear whether you see this as simply the way of the world or the way of capitalism and the modern era, or what?
Okay. So yeah, my definition of secularism, one of the things I wrote about in my previous book, I wrote a book called Secularism. The way in which I approached it, kind of working with the kind of Assadian model, the genealogical Foucauldian sort of approach to it. I was very taken, with, a certain kind of hyper-rationality, that kind of rationalization of religion, and it doesn't go away, it changes. Religion changes, as does science. And so as I argued in that book, and it's something I assume, I don't really talk about it in Neuromatic, it's just there, is that, like, secularism doesn't exist. It's a term that we use, right? It's a term that we use to get leverage and interpretive leverage upon these kinds of events that you're like, wait a minute, the categories that we're using aren't quite fitting. And I've always found secularism, particularly when it's not used, as not reified, where you can really use it to sort of just parse out these kind of interesting stories of, in this book, or this project, Religion and Science, how it's getting played out. And so secularism, in a sense, fills in that gap. There's something going on in the larger culture. I don't know, Weber called it the iron cage of capitalism, maybe. There's all kinds of discourse. We have all these words that we can use that all sort of highlight a different dimension of this kind of weird space of modernity that we're in, right? Which I think goes back to a certain kind of the fact that despite our valuations of certainty and security, and that's not how life is, I don't think. And I think there's something about, for me, Devo, it's interesting, I've talked to many members of the band, and they know what I'm doing. And I think they unfortunately think I might be writing a book about them, but I'm actually writing a book in a sense alongside them and with them. In a sense, I'm very taken by their sort of youthful exuberance and the way in which they sort of embrace some of these ideas that were so, not counterculture in the hippie kind of way, but just like, to think about them thinking these thoughts and saying these things in 1972 in ways that strike me as something, maybe, for lack of a better term, prophetic on some level. And so I'm very taken with the idea that the linear progress it's not something that as a person, that doesn't satisfy me descriptively, and obviously prescriptively it's not something I would put forward either.
Where does post-secularism fit in?
Say that into the microphone.
Where does post-secularism fit into your analysis?
I don't know what that is. What is post-secularism?
We'll talk about it tomorrow.
We'll talk about it. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'll leave it there.
So my quick follow-up is back to Sylvester Johnson and all that. The American Liberians, the people settling as Black Americans into Liberia, he was presenting Christian, and contains within that an account of of Christianity, which has its own temporality in relation to this. There are other things. They carry race in a way that is not there for the indigenous Liberians, for whom it's not a significant identity to be black. It's significant to be in this or that tribal or ethnic group, and all of that. But they also carry with them a temporality of this, which in many ways fits them for their role in Firestone's scheme and a capitalist salvation. That doesn't quite work out. And so I'm sort of I want to go back and push again on whether capitalism is a category that matters here. You quickly alluded to Weber, but a lot. We could run an argument, I don't want to right now, around capitalism as being about temporality, right? The reduction of labor to labor time, blah, 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 right? And whether you're interested in that kind of argument, which seems to work really well for Akron, right? And Akron becomes a great typification of a capitalist story. But one could, in the spirit of Chemical Girl, take this into a different domain where it is not in any way bounded by something like capitalism, but it is asserted to be a broader reality just in and of itself. So is that kind of distinction, is that kind of question about the capitalism significant? Because it seems to me a difference between what's going on with the later colonization of Liberia by Firestone and the earlier, in a way that's interesting.
So you're suggesting it's perhaps a different moment in the histories of capitalism, that its form and its shape and its sort of directives are shifting in ways that are both continuous but also inflected differently.
And that there are other things going on by capitalism. So capitalism has more fully saturated the story by the second phase.
Well, I think in that sense, you know, I mean, I think capitalism it works here in every pore. You know, I mean, secularism. I mean, you know, it's another word that we use to talk about the economic relations we have, and you know, that kind of thing. But there's something about that linear narrative that obviously is inflecting, you know, Firestone and Schwab. I mean, they see this as it's inflecting the American Colonization Society, and there's something about. And so that notion of temporality and that linearity, I absolutely understand it as an imaginary and motivating desire and motivating metaphysics, let's say, of much of the work. And again, going back to, you know, one of Debo's great sort of phrases they use a lot is like, in the beginning was the end. It reminds me of like, what does capitalism produce? Its own grave diggers, right? It just like negates that sort of linear. Like you can't stand on that for your moral value. Yeah. So
I'm going to have to call this very, very rich conversation to a temporary pause. We have refreshments in the lobby, so please join us, and I'm sure John would be happy to be in conversation with any of us there. So thank you so much for coming to the center, for coming to listen to John Modern, and we hope to see you again.
thank you, everybody. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.